So we're ready to take this off, and of course I'm just going to pass it to you, Konstantinos. So very pleased to chair this wonderful last panel is Konstantinos Georgaras, and of course he is the head of the Canadian Intellectual Property Office, and he is backed by popular demand, as he was in this role last year and he was formidable. So back to you, Konstantinos.
Well, thank you very much, Pina, for the kind introduction. And I can say with 39 years in the public service, Pina's the only one who can actually pronounce my name correctly. So maybe that's. Yes, as Pina mentioned, last time I was here, actually was November 2022, which was just a few weeks after ChatGPT was launched. And at that time, we were all astounded with the capabilities. In fact, I even used it to help draft some of my remarks back then. Amazing what has happened in just a year and a half. And what I get, and I'm looking at this from the periphery, my signal of how impressive this is when you look at the people who are actually programming, the people who are actually in the middle of all this. They themselves are amazed at the pace of this going forward. So with that in mind, how do we try to prepare ourselves for societal benefits? Safety, privacy, data, security, accountability, transparency, human oversight, agency, consent. I mean, all of these deep issues. And then the question is, how do we move forward in terms of trying to create the right framework so that we can ensure societal benefit? I'm surrounded by some deep expertise on this table. So let me go through from my right. We have at the end Nadine, Letson, who is head of corporate, external, and legal affairs at Microsoft Canada. We then have Rebecca Finlay, who's chief executive officer, partnership on AI, followed by someone who needs no introduction, Professor D'Agostino, Director of Connected Minds, Co-Director, Center of AI and Society, and Founder, Director of IP Innovation Clinic. To my left, we have Aviv Gaon, Senior Lecturer, Radzyner Law School, Reichman U. And then finally, Jonathon, Penney, Associate Professor, Osgoode Hall Law School at York University. So let me put out the first question as an opener, and I'll ask my colleagues here to also introduce themselves. So can you please tell us about yourself and how your work engages with the topic of the societal impacts of AI and innovation? So why don't we start at the far right of our table here, Nadine.
Is this? Yeah, the Microsoft person can't.
Oh boy, do you want to try this one?
Here we go.
We're going to have to.
Okay, I think this one is working. That's it. So hi, I'm really privileged and very glad to be here. I am Nadine Letson. As Konstantinos, now I'm embarrassed to pronounce his name because I've been has said, I'm the head of corporate external legal affairs at Microsoft Canada. And what that means is I have a team that is sort of half and half lawyers and government and policy people. The lawyers mostly responsible for doing transactions on behalf of Microsoft in the United States and Canada. There's a group in the US as well as Canada, and the policy folks and GA folks in mostly in Ottawa. And so, in terms of how I interact, with the societal impacts, I would say every day. Microsoft has had a responsible AI standard since 2018, and since then the company has been very focused on issues around how AI impacts our customers and society at large. And so just to give you an example, as all of the Microsoft subsidiaries do, we have a AI ethics committee at Microsoft Canada that consists of a group of 6 or 7 people from various parts of the business. We get together and we look at projects that our services folks may engage in that involve AI and are potentially high risk. And so the group of us will give an opinion as to whether or not we think it's the type of work that Microsoft wants to engage in based on a set of ethics and code that we have. So that's something internal that I'm engaged in. Then externally, obviously, with my team, I'm involved in advocating for AI policy and other policy related to technology in Canada. Obviously, the AI Data Act has been front and center for us for a while, and just making sure Mark doesn't have any utensils left. This may be a tough spot for me to say. And that's part of what I do. And then finally, one of the best things I get to do are engage with people like Pina and to be engaged in organizations like this, which is very much encouraged by Microsoft. As a company, Microsoft has come a long way. If you're old enough to remember, the late 90s, I think Microsoft has come a long way as a company, and very much concerned about how the technology that we create impacts the places where we live and work. And that's part of the reason why we support events like this and are so happy to do so. And I would say lastly, I've also have been engaged with the Digital Technology Supercluster. It's headquartered in Vancouver, but the national organization, and have been engaged in some skilling projects with them that Microsoft has supported. So a partnership with digital and with an organization called Empower that provides skilling to marginalized groups, and we provide curriculum as well as some funding, and it helps to give the skills that people need in order to be able to function in this new world of AI, and that's been particularly rewarding and something I'm sure we'll talk a bit about, but skilling is super important. So I'll stop there for now.
Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca Finlay. I often start my introductions by asking the questions, how many of you feel that the world is more divided, more siloed, more polarized than ever before? Yes. And how many of you fundamentally believe we need to create spaces like today's conference? I'm sensing you're going to mostly agree with this. Where we can bring those diverse perspectives. I mean, this is exactly what you were talking about in your keynote. And I feel like that is essentially the mandate that I have as the CEO of the Partnership on AI. And I often say that it can be truly uncomfortable. But I absolutely believe that it can also be transformative. The Partnership on AI is a global nonprofit. We were founded in 2016 to be intentionally multi-stakeholder. And so in the first instance, we received funding from 6 of the large technology companies, including Microsoft, but we have around our table many academic institutions, some of them based here in Canada, as well as organizations like the ACLU in the United States, many of the human rights and advocacy organizations that are on the front lines of thinking about tech equity and tech policy. And just in the last couple of years since I've been with the organization, we have really been bringing policymakers and multilateral organizations directly into that conversation as well. And so when I think about the question of societal impact, well, that is essentially what we do. So all the way from looking at questions of fairness, transparency, and accountability, through to labor market impacts and the future of work, through to questions of how do you do community-centered, inclusive, diverse technology design, right from the early stages of AI right through to its deployment and eventual monitoring. And last year we released a set of guidelines on large models, so foundation and frontier models. What does safety look like across the life cycle, all the way from pre-R&D, systems, cards, and disclosures, right through to post-deployment monitoring. So I'm really excited to be a part of the conversation today. And I have 3 key messages that I really want to deliver. One is that policymakers have a toolkit of approaches, much more than just regulation. And each one of them is important. And we're seeing them deployed in very different ways across jurisdictions. And I think thinking about how we as members, both within government but also outside of government, can work together to harness all of those tools in the toolkit beyond just regulation, I think is crucially important. Secondly, when it comes to responsibility, we've got to have transparency. Now, I know transparency is not an end unto itself, but it is the first step. And we need to see companies and other actors who are deploying AI to truly take on what disclosure means if we're going to have accountability and oversight, both for our policymakers and for our citizens. And then thirdly, I think Canada has an opportunity. I now lead an organization that was begun in Silicon Valley. Our headquarters are still in San Francisco, but I'm extremely proud Canadian. And I would love to see Canada really meeting this moment in terms of our capacity to both lead domestically, but also internationally as well.
That's great. So it is an exciting time. And on me, you've heard some of the remarks throughout the day, so I'm not going to go through all of my hats. But just to give you a window into why I chose to become a lawyer and go to law school and now get into this space is that I believe the law and policy is really a vehicle of social change and to better society. And that's really why I decided to become a lawyer. And so when you look at technologies and technologies developed across time, you see that there's often different markets that establish themselves and many communities get lifted up and others get sidelined. So to me, I've always been interested in lifting up those underrepresented communities. And that's where we really see now the collision of the law with AI and really the impact that AI can have. One area that I've been interested in, and the IP Innovation Clinic is up there, is really to put my research into practice and roll up my sleeves, and where the law and regulation can help, then I'm going to try and do it through education and through ensuring that the structure and the system is there to support change. So that really social change is not so much just the law, but the entire system has to work. And in the innovation IP ecosystem, for me, it needs a lot of tweaking. Right, Georgaras? In the sense that with the clinic, it was something that I started in 2010, and over the course of the years, we've subsidized over $2 million in billable fees that, we're actually we did pro bono work, and it was really a win-win, enabling our students, and many of them you've seen at the front, to have their training opportunities, and partnering with leading law firms to be able to give back and help often those who do not have the funds. And one thing that hasn't come up yet enough is that there's also, the cost of living, right, is going up, and the cost of, let's say, filing a patent is expensive. And thinking about women, and tomorrow's International Women's Day, women are very much the have-nots of the IP innovation ecosystem. There's about 16% of them that are international patent filers. Their names are there. So that's just not nearly enough. And when you look at indigenous communities, the stakes are that much higher. So what I tried to do is put this IP Innovation Clinic together with many partners, many of them in this room. The Skygauge Robotics is, I don't know if you've talked to Nikita there. Yeah, there he is. There's IntelliJoint that you were here just up before, and it just warms my heart because we were involved in the first patent. And then Indigenous Friends is here too. So when you see all of these success stories, and when you look at then the power that AI can have to really animate the possibilities. So we also created an AI-powered chatbot, because there's only so many questions you can answer the same way, and the same questions that get repeated. So it's really ripe for innovation, and that's where we're actually going into a second stage in iterating now this chatbot, and I'm really grateful to the federal government, the National IP Clinics program, and ISET in particular for supporting this. So this is where indirectly, through programming and resourcing, you can also help the system. So this is Just one example of some of the work that I do to where technology, I can see it as really beneficial and help affect positive social impact and change. This one is a short thing.
We'll keep the
I'm going to
mic,
mark
right.
it so that.
All right, thank you. First, thanks Pina for having me and having us here. It's always a great pleasure to be in Toronto and also to engage with this important topic. So I just have 2 pointers that I want to make here in the beginning about my research and where my research is going related to this panel. And we have great expectation from us to actually put all these discussions into some relative relevant answers. So I started my research as a Pina's student a few years ago. I think it's mostly almost 10 years from today. 10 years, yeah, almost a decade. And I started working on AI and IP, which I thought, and it was quite exciting during those days. Is something that is going to be big, and apparently we were right at the beginning. And what I thought about is important. It also relates to regulation and regulatory decisions. Is that we found out that that AI has no definition. It's not really legal definition. So one of the pointers when we have a discussion about regulation is that there is a big hole, in my opinion, in the way that we define AI for legal purposes. So first of all, when we try to think about solution for certain problems, I think the first question that we need to ask ourselves is what is AI and how we define AI? Because you will see that in many different regulations and laws and amendments around this country and around other countries, you see that as a problem because people try to impose big aspirations to what is AI and try to create some legal terms and legal definitions that is basically problematic or something that you can't really impose. So this is one of the angles that I think is really important to understand and to engage with. And the second part of my research is something that I started to do after I graduating, is look into other angles on the framing of AI. And the current work that I'm doing today is about the future of human driving. And people talking about AI. AI is also part of what we are seeing today with autonomous vehicles. And the question of autonomous vehicles, this is where I engage with the impact on society, is that people tend to forget that cars are not only technology, like everything else that we're doing here. Cars impact our life, impact our society. When you think about the way that we drive today, is obviously something that is really human criteria, is something that is reflected on human personalities. And when you take it away from us and you put it into something else, then we might lose that as humanity. We might lose some way of interaction with other people. So that's something that we should really start to think about. And also, when we are thinking about regulation and regulatory framework, we also should address the way that this type of technology impact us as society. I think that should.
That's great. Joe Penney, I am indeed an associate professor at Osgoode Law School. I'm also faculty associate at Harvard Berkman Klein Center in Society and longtime fellow at the University of Toronto Citizens Lab. I mentioned those additional affiliations because they concern some of the projects I'll mention up here in our conversation. Let me begin to say that it's great to be here, and thank you, Pina, for again a fantastic conference and a great conversation. It's great to be on such a distinguished panel. I know Aviv went back and Penney went back, and since I'm also a lawyer on the panel, I may as well talk a little bit about my introduction in this context. My area of interest and I guess research is really at the intersection of law, technology, and human rights. I've always been fascinated with technology and its implications for the law, for human rights, and its impact. As a teen, I was on my local PBS system. Later, I was an early adopter. I was a nerdy internet kid on IRC and the internet, and studied philosophy and computer science in undergrad and continued that trajectory in law school. And so today I'm really interested in AI, its law, policy, and governance. And some of the projects that I'm working on in particular, for example, is thinking about some of the risks that some of my other fellow panelists have talked about so far. So managing the risks of AI systems while also allowing for ethical innovation at the same time. A lot of my work too, both in respect of AI and other technologies, looks at the impact, right? So not just in terms of legal implications, but also thinking about when you combine these systems with how they're operationalized in law and policy, how does it affect our behavior, impact people? That's the privacy implications, surveillance implications. That gets us into bigger questions about information capitalism, surveillance capitalism, and all of that. But also, one area of my work is privacy and security, and I think one of the really fascinating things about AI and machine learning systems is how much of a challenge it is to do privacy and security effectively, to do it well. And that's a real problem and challenge today. I think that came up in some of the conversations already, and we'll continue to have those conversations. Two examples of those projects that I mentioned. So one, as a collaboration with Bruce Schneier, a security expert at Harvard, we were looking at automated legal enforcement and its impact, and thinking about learning lessons from, for example, more rudimentary technologies like breathalyzers in the criminal law context. What procedures do you need in place to ensure fairness, transparency, to ensure rights are guaranteed when these systems are deployed at scale in society? Or another project in relation to security. This is actually a collaboration with a friend who's a machine learning scientist at Microsoft, and we look at adversarial machine learning that is thinking about the legal implications of adversarial attacks on AI systems. So for example, if you intentionally enter certain prompts in a generative AI system like ChatGPT, in order to get ChatGPT to spit out confidential or private information or trading data, what are the legal implications of that? What are the ethical implications of that? And what does the law have to say about it? So that's another project that I'm working on.
All right, thank you all. So we do have the one live mic, and I'll push it back to the other end of the panel. So really quite fortunate to have such deep expertise at this table today. So next question, so from your perspectives, can you speak to some of the developments on this front, as well as the challenges that you see and ways of overcoming these challenges? And to make it real, if you have any specific examples or case studies, please share those. Nadine, you're first up.
Sure. So, I mean, I think tons of examples where I think, we have seen positive developments. Certainly, we heard people talk this morning about healthcare. One example in particular that I know about is a small Canadian company called DNA Step that has developed a platform that allows organizations to look at health data without removing the health data from its source. So being able to look at data, protect privacy, keep it secure, and collect the necessary data. I think as someone said earlier today, Canada is a very diverse country, and so the health data that we have because of our diversity is very valuable, and it's something that we ought to be able to use. And I'm seeing AI help us access that technology in a safe and privacy compliant way. So lots of great examples of where I think that AI is having a very positive impact on society. In terms of challenges, I think top of mind for me is the interference or potential interference with elections. We're in a year where some 40% of people in the world are going to be participating in a democratic election this year. It's a bit of a bumper crop. And so the use of AI to create deep fakes, to interfere with those election campaigns is a huge concern, and I think that would be one of the challenges that is top of mind for me. But again, technology can help us to solve some of these issues, and so while it's a challenge, I think Microsoft and other technology companies are cooperating under a tech accord, for example, to share information in order to identify deepfakes. Microsoft has set up actually an email address so that candidates from wherever they are in the world can notify us about issues they may be having with potential deepfakes, that then we can have our specialists in security and in our digital crimes unit, that really is what it's called, the DCU, can follow up on these things and try to help take them down. So I guess that's what I would say are top of mind in terms of benefits and challenges and all.
Okay. Maybe we'll stick with synthetic media and generative AI because that's an interesting one. And so much of what I've heard in the panel previously is this dual use nature, right? The fact that we could be using AI technologies to do all these fabulous things. The idea being that, you know, the example was brought up, you know, you might want the heat in your house to come down, you know, which would be fabulous. It also could make people feel as if they're being surveilled on their couches. So, you know, those sort of this notion of how do we protect, you know, all of the human rights and human privacy and agency, and at the same time think about how to deploy these things as well. So one of the examples I love to use about generative AI, because frankly I am quite concerned about many of the generative AI models that are out there and the way they are being now moving from chatbots and being integrated into all sorts of other software products and services, is the example of the Khan Academy working with OpenAI to test out ChatGPT with both teachers and with students as a way to use it in a way to prompt creativity. Somebody talked about it as a collaborator. So how can we start to use these systems to really benefit and fulfill the needs that we have as humans, whether we're students or whether we're teachers? And what I like about that is it goes at one of the areas that we're most concerned about with regard to generative AI, is its impact on the educational system. And what I also like about it is that it's a pilot. So the idea is that it's an open pilot with open teachers reporting on how it's working and how it's not working for them and students. So it's not being developed in a way that it is being imposed on a community. When I often say that one of the concerns I have most about AI is when it's deployed, whether it's in criminal justice or healthcare or otherwise, in low resource settings, because it is not a shortcut to efficiency and productivity. It is rather, we need to think about how it augments the humans and the systems and structures that are in those places. So that's one thing I really like. That's an example I would use. There's all sorts of great examples of how AI is really developing all sorts of unique products and services across the economy, and I'm really excited, particularly about the ones that relate to climate change. And that's where I think some of the challenges are as well with regard to generative media. So we started to work on this a long time ago, before generative AI was even a thing, and we started to see deep fakes starting to emerge. Now, they weren't very good when we started to look at them with some of the companies and some of the media companies like the New York Times and others who are the BBC who were quite concerned. I should say the CBC is a leader in this space as well, so it's good to know that. And we started to think about, so how do you detect these? Like, is there a technical way to detect deep fakes? And could that be a way to solve one of the challenges? And through research over time, what the community has discovered is that it's actually quite hard to detect deep fakes. And it's actually much easier to authenticate real content. And so over the last couple of years, what you've seen is this move to understand how do you better authenticate what is real, this question of provenance. You might have heard of the discussion around watermarking, which has become quite live over the last 12 months. And watermarking is only one of many different technical ways in which this could be done. So it's an interesting way of thinking about synthetic media by, rather than focusing on the technology, focus on what is real, what is validated through either our legal systems or, in the case of a news organization, through a trusted source, through a trusted system of delivery, and how do we use that to better manage the challenge that someone raised earlier around what's going to happen to epistemic knowledge in the world that we're operating in. And I'll just say where that has led is to a set of what we developed, a code of conduct, really, both for creators, for developers and distributors around consent and around disclosure, around the use of synthetic media. Now we're starting to see that move into policy. And I think that's one of the exciting things is they don't sit in different worlds,
Yeah.
right? There are ways in which these can come together.
That's great. So, in terms of, I guess what I see as a development is that now we finally understand that it's all about the data. And while it's all about the data, we haven't figured out how to govern that data. And so the struggle is real. And to me, this remains a concern. And it's something that I actually had, and as an example, I might dip back 20 years ago. So this was pre, I guess, this, what we're talking about now with generative AI, but the very seeds of it were there. So this was when I was at the University of Oxford, and I was approached by some social scientists and computer scientists and said, we want to study this database. And this database was called eDiamond. And it was essentially 4 hospitals involved in this project. So 4 hospitals, you had a big tech company, startup as well, and the University of Oxford, our researchers, were pooling together data from the hospitals in this grid. It's supposed to be this intelligent database to be accessed in real time to treat and cure, hopefully, breast cancer, and be able to anticipate the problem so that the surgeon in the operating room could just, flash up some diagrams and they'd be able to intuit exactly where the tumor was with deep analysis of a whole bunch of other data getting pooled from all of these hospitals. So this was actually, then Prime Minister Tony Blair funded this project, £5 million. He actually did lots of press conferences on it. And we wanted to study this to see what is the governance structure here, who owns the data. So besides the obvious privacy issues that were at place, we thought we need to ensure that there's a clear chain of title so that this data could be repurposed and accessed by other parties, because the goal really is to save lives, and that's really come up, that you want intelligent technology to be able to use data, analyze it for a greater purpose. When we went back into the agreements that were there between the different parties, we saw that it was only the tech company that actually had clear rights and had given itself rights in perpetuity to use the data, so rights forever. Whereas there was lack of clarity between all the other parties. So it wasn't clear whether it was the hospitals that owned the data, whether it could have been the patients, and it was a mess. So this data became stultified such that no other party wanted to touch it, so that many years of work and many millions of dollars were really wasted. The only party that had rights going forward and still using that data is the tech company. So this, to me, did not pass the smell test. And going forward, we need to do better. And what is the proper governance framework when this was 20 years ago and now this is happening in real time, and who owns what is even a bigger question, because we have these intelligent databases that are everywhere. And the stakes are that much higher. So what is the proper governance framework? When you look at copyright law, and Barry mentioned this, copyright law wasn't equipped to really deal with these complex questions. Just like a term of protection, like what is a term of protection when you're altering a work in real time? How do you fix that? What is fixation? So there's a lot of, I'm not going to go into the, all the nuances in copyright law, but suffice it to say that it is problematic to apply copyright law on these databases. So when we look at regulatory frameworks and the law, and again, in real time, every time I look, I turn on my social media, I see a new law coming up in some country, a 180 being taken. The UK first says that we need an exemption in copyright, and then no, now we need to compensate the rights holders. India says we're not going to regulate, and then they're going to regulate. So this is happening all over the place, and it doesn't seem to me that this is the way forward. And so when we think about the law, we need to figure out what is that international mechanism to set those standards, which we do need, but we also need, and I love what you said about guidelines and codes and things to start to get on the same page and to have different parties come together in a way that is sustainable and amicable, and avoid access to justice issues and go to court, because I'm not a fan of going to court, even though I wanted to be a litigator at one point. I also think that the approach we should take is a sector-specific one, looking at the health sector, the biomedical community, the energy sector, because each of those have different spaces and different customs and ways and understandings of doing things. And of course, education, I'm a very big fan of that, being my home. And so I'm really excited to be at these conferences and have these exchanges, because I think really that's how we start to make a difference.
Thank you, Pina.
Thank you. So I'll just add up to some of the comment that we made earlier. So I see many challenges that we have to face, especially given what is happening around the world around regulation. We see, and everyone is talking about it, it's obviously very important. We see what is happening in the EU. I think that the AIEU is going to make the new standard. We saw that with GDPR. Initially, when GDPR enacted in the EU, everyone look at that and say, I don't know what to do with that. I don't know if I need to apply something about that. But we saw what happened with GDPR. Within 2 years, it became the standard. And everyone, everywhere in the world, is trying to impose GDPR standards, even if it's not in the regulation, if it is not in a part of the legislation in the country. Companies understand that they have to implement GDPR standards. So I think that this is something that we're going to see today, and it's important for governments and for companies to address those concerns and to give those companies and corporations that are working within the state the tools that they will have, the necessary tools to actually understand what is the impact for them. So that's sort of a challenge and a development. I want to add up 2 points. One is about the data. So I totally agree with Pina. Data is the everyone understands that data is the issue. But there is positive developments about data. I think that governments around the world understand the problems, and we see different initiatives that lead the way to open what we call free access to certain companies in certain areas. Governments got into this area too, and understand that they have to provide access to certain data in order to be able to actually compete in this very competitive environment. So that's a very, I think, optimistic development. And the other elements, we are in an academic setting. So in academic setting, I can't ignore one of the big elephant in the room. This is what we are going to do in the academia. Everywhere around the world, academics like us talking about that. What we're going to do with seminars, with papers, they have become obsolete, irrelevant anymore. Generative AI is changing that. And I can only recommend, I don't have much time to get into that, but I saw last week an interview with NVIDIA CEO. And he mentioned something that I really thought about it. It was great, because 10 years ago, everyone told us you have to go to study computer science. I remember that. Everyone told us you have to study computer science. Even if you're a law student, you have to know computer science, because everyone in law is going to program. Yeah. And today tell us, no, you don't need to learn computer science anymore. No, coding is automatically. You just have to learn how to use the coding to be more creative, to be more human. So, and I think that we as academics, as industry leaders, we have to try to be able to develop those tools for the next generation, because in next year, 2 years from now, they will get into Osgoode and other great schools around the country, and they will ask us what they need to do, what they need to learn to be prepared for what is coming. And I think that we are not ready to give them those answers, and we need to.
Wow, those are big issues. Being the law professor at the end of the table, wow, I just learned I'm obsolete. I just put the mic down. I guess the line used to be like learn to code, now it's learn to prompt, right? I guess that's the implication there. So these are big challenges, and broadly speaking, thinking about AI governance in society, in business, in government, and I think this has come out in some of the comments. There's some tensions, right? There's the Brussels effect, where you have Europe that, like with data protection, like with the GDPR. It seems like the EU's AI Act is going to be the most comprehensive standard out there, and could become the gold standard. Right? But then there's now this competing effect too, I call the Beijing effect. And this is something you talk to Americans, policymakers, even members in industry. They point to the fact that China is really committed to investing in AI, becoming the global AI leader very soon. And so American policymakers, they're just like, we can't let China win, right? So we have to be less concerned about risk and policy and regulation and just invest in growth and ensure that we're the innovators, right? And I think that's a conversation that Canadians have to have, where we draw the balance. And I think that goes to some of the challenges that the Pina and others have raised. I think one big challenge today that's a process that's ongoing in Canada, the United States, internationally, is standards development. I think this would be really, really important. If you just take your toaster and you flip it over, and you take a look at some of the standards that are used, so for example, UL 1026, International Safety Standard for Appliance Voltage, that standard is 126 pages long. If you examine the Canadian Electrical Code Standard 22.2, that standard is 80 pages long. CSA 1335, 1335.29, Safety Standards for Household Electrical Appliances, 202 pages. If you take a look at the EU's AI Act, which is right now the leading comprehensive scheme for standards and enforcement anywhere in the world. Take a look at it. All the standards are in Chapter 2, and it's 6 pages long. So I think we've got a real challenge ahead in developing standards. And along that route, I think there's a few things that we need to think thoughtfully about that we may not have thought about when we think about new established technologies like social media and the internet. We didn't think practically the way we're thinking today about these systems in conferences and conversations like this is thinking about human-computer interaction, right? So part of the challenge, I think deepfakes is a great example of this, right? Deepfakes, a real technical challenge, and it's fantastic to have companies like Microsoft thinking about this and trying to develop technologies to head off, to preempt, to deal with this kind of challenge. But on the other side, as these companies are doing this great work, you have a human behavioral challenge to this, right? Because while deepfakes are a challenge, cheap fakes still work, right? So maybe I just Photoshop something, I post it on Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it today. It's going to potentially go viral. You just take a video of Nancy Pelosi and slow it down, and everyone believes that she's intoxicated, because that's what people want to believe. There's a behavioral challenge to these technology challenges that I think needs to be a key part of developing standards at the design stage, but also developing law and policy at the broader national level as well. Another example I'd like to give is when you think about driverless cars, for example, the typical thing that driver assistance technology uses today, like your Tesla, it gives you an alert to take over control of the car, right? And in response to regulator pressure, it's now Tesla's designed so there's even more alerts. Like, by the way, take over control of the car, take over control. I'm going offline. But studies have shown that the time it takes for people to respond to these kinds of alerts, we're really, really bad at staying attentive behind the wheel of driverless cars. 17 seconds. It's the average time it takes a driver to retake control of a vehicle after receiving an alert. 17 seconds. It is slow. And all of those, fancy philosophical discussions about, like the car crashing in, will the AI make a decision analyzing all the participants? 17 seconds, everyone's, run down in the crosswalk. So there's an HCI, a human interaction component to this that we need to be thoughtful about. And lastly, the other challenge I think when it comes to standards development is making their development more participatory, more democratic. Bias is a real problem in these systems. We have to make sure that it's not just industry and government having that conversation. Civil society has to be part of that conversation. I think we need to be better at that. I also wanted to talk about some of the challenges of browsing data. We'll talk about that later, but I'll leave it there. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Jonathon. And then we'll move the mic back down to the other end. Our time is going very quickly. Perhaps we could turn to, we had a discussion around optimistic and pessimistic approaches to looking at this. What we heard from the last panel on neurotech, very, very optimistic in many areas, and also understanding some of the issues, the international issues we touched on as well. The question is this: so Canada has positioned itself as a significant hub of AI, and AI, of course, is developing at an accelerating pace globally. Our keynote speaker, David Lametti, noted the pace of regulatory change may not be at the pace of the technological change. So the question for the panelists is, while we may not have all of the required governance mechanisms in place right now, what practical or more immediate strategies could governments, industries, and academia follow to incentivize ethical AI research and development?
Sure, that's a big question. I think what I'd like to say to start is, just in talking about Canada and being a leader in AI, I mean, we have legislation that is on the table right now in front of Parliament. What I wanted to say was that, while I applaud that, we are working towards getting legislation in place, I think we need to be very careful about having legislation that goes beyond what the EU AI Act is, and right now, what we have in front of us would actually be more stringent than what we're seeing in the EU. And Canada, I think, has very pointed out as a middling power. I don't think it's a good idea to position ourselves beyond, the most stringent laws that exist. I think what we need to do is find the right balance, as we often do as Canadians, the right principled approach, the right balance between innovation and protecting risk, which I think is what we all want to do, is we all want to protect Canadians from harm. And I think we need to work harder at finding that balance so that we can continue to be the leaders in AI. Otherwise, choices are going to be made. The United States is close geographically. We're going to have startups and organizations that choose to go to jurisdictions where it's easier to comply with regulation, or where they don't feel like they have extraneous risk. And I think that is something that we all need to think about as we're regulating in Canada. In terms of what we can do while we wait, I think education for me would be the most important piece. I think we need to be educating all of our professions and all of our young people as they're coming up, to the point someone made about, we need to shift the attitudes. We need to shift how our kids think, how the next generation thinks. And I think educating upcoming students, whether they're in college, university, maybe getting back into high school, about these issues and how to think about them is super important, because that is the only way that we're going to see, I think, a shift change. And then the other thing I would say is ensuring that we have diverse voices at the table when we are developing these things, and to the extent that businesses are acquiring AI, or the government as a big purchaser, businesses and governments can require that the vendors from whom they're buying this AI technology have systems in place, ethical systems in place to review what it is they're creating, and have systems in place to ensure that there's been a diverse perspective that's gone into the tools that they created. And I think those types of things will help to push for the type of society and the type of AI in society that we want to see.
Well, I just want to pick up on the conversation that we've been sort of talking about in terms of deep fakes and harmful online content and, you know, synthetic media. And I do want to say that I think things like an online harms bill that is focusing on some of the most egregious forms of non-consensual intimate imagery, or CSAM, is crucially important. And I think I was very happy to see Canada. I know it takes, the challenge with regulation is it takes time, right? I think in the UK, I don't know how long this one took in Canada, but in the UK it was, theirs just came into force in January, and I think they started it about 5 years ago. So, I mean, that's the challenge with regulation, is the time it takes to actually come into force. So two comments. One is regulatory sandboxes. I don't know how prevalent those are in Canada, but I think there are opportunities for government to be leaning in to iterate through technology development that is at that human AI interface, that's thinking about how you manage creating systems that meet current regulatory conditions, but also allow for innovations around regulatory approaches. Well, and I'm using regulation broadly speaking in terms of those pieces. So I think that's a really important piece for us to be thinking about. And then, you know, yes, one of the things that Canada is known for is that we invested early and in a substantial way when it came to AI research when it wasn't commercially viable, right? That's where Joshua Bengio and Jeff Hinton and Jonathon, because he wasn't Canadian, but part of CIPO was implicated in that work, and we should be proud of that. But the other thing that Canada has is we have a phenomenal, and we're seeing it today, social sciences and legal scholarly community, and people who are able to go right at the questions that we're raising around how do we take what is a flashy new technology and drive it into real use, work through, and that's where we need to be continuing to fund that type of research. And that goes hand in hand, and this is my third point, with making sure that we're bringing a diversity of perspectives to that, right? So whether it's indigenous communities who are creating sovereign large language models or otherwise, that's where we're going to start to see some of the innovation taking hold.
And that is exactly Connected Minds. So I couldn't have orchestrated this better. Thank you. And this wasn't even planned. Connected Minds really is that, bringing together diverse voices in both the aims that we want to do, but also our very structure that we have set up in order to ensure that we are advancing change and having that cross-disciplinary approach. Co-creation has been a term that's been mentioned. It's really the academy working together with industry and community. And we have this baked in our structure. When it's a fund and we have rigorous, we spent the last year, I'm looking at Caitlin, that's what we did. So you're talking about immediate impact. The last year, most of my weeks have been filled with meetings ensuring that we had an ironclad foundation. So the goals that we're trying to achieve are met with rigor. So we have guidelines, social impact assessment guidelines. We have an Indigenous advisory circle, so that if someone says, I want to collect data, and then they mention Indigenous communities, but wait, did you consult with them? So that will not pass the smell test with the Indigenous advisory circle. They have a veto right, and that project would never get funded. So what we're trying to do is really incite that consultation from the ground up and ensure that the very communities that are going to be affected by these technologies are involved in their development. And the industries that are also going to be involved are also there. So we want to pair up community, industry, and researchers together to really make a difference in this space. And that's really where the ethics come, right? Because the ethics are really the cornerstone to ensure that people are consulted and being heard for things that matter to them, and where this technology can raise significant harms, that it could be prevented. We're trying to anticipate that through our work. And this is where governments, I'm very grateful, like the government funded us. They need to keep funding these initiatives. And we're also talking to other CFRFs, because there's other incredible projects across Canada. So this is really a happy time in Canada, because a lot of them are also looking around these questions. And I think there's going to be some real magic coming out of these. So that'll be Bracing for Impact number 5.
Happy times in Measure.
Right.
Okay. Just the essence of time, just two very quick pointers. Reference the last panel, health panel. I think the main point that I want to make here is do no harm. think it's really important when you're talking about government regulation. And just to give you one example, I don't mean that government should not regulate, obviously that's what they need to do, but they need to be very careful in what we are doing. And I think the best example, I'm sorry for referencing GDPR the second time, I promised I wouldn't do that, but if you look into what happened with Europe and the GDPR, one of the things that they came up researching is that the impact on innovation. This is why they put a strong emphasis on the current regulation about innovation. I don't really know if it's going to work for them. So we have to understand that if we want to come into some regulation, we have to take in mind the impact of regulation on innovation, and we had to find the right balance. And that's, I think, the most important part.
Great. Yeah. So on this kind, I think it's going back to some of the broader tensions between governance and innovation challenges, and part of what I had mentioned before, and Aviv has mentioned that the GDPR, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other regulatory initiatives out there. But I think once you step outside the lawmaking and policymaking process, I think that process is underway in Canada. The Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, will change. There'll be some changes to it before it's enacted, and we'll talk more about that later. But I think beyond that, I think what's important for government, just broadly speaking, is to set a standard and to show leadership in this context. Right? Maybe this comes back to Aviv's mission to do no harm. I would say for government is to today start adopting best practices, right? So don't necessarily use minimal standards, don't engage in large-scale law reforms while excluding government or leaving privacy concerns or data protection concerns for government and only focusing on industry. That's only going to be half-hearted. I think government needs to serve leadership, adopt best practices, and this comes back to the Brussels effect, where it might be that Canada will come up with a different balance between innovation and regulation and managing risks of high-risk AI systems or high-impact AI systems. But again, I think that to promote ethics and justice in society, both industry, civil society, and government can't be working with the lowest common denominator, adopt best practices today, and before even the regulatory mechanisms are in place.
Great. Unfortunately, we are at time, and just to return to the question, the name of the panel, Guardrails Up. We've heard that there are many different ways to define AI, and therefore define guardrails, but we've also heard a number of different approaches, other tools in the toolkit that could also be explored. We've only just scratched the surface, but at this point, please join me in thanking the panelists for this wonderful